The circumstances that got Pot of Greed banned way back in old school Yu-Gi-Oh! Are the same ones that prevent it from coming back today. A free +1 is simply too overpowered, and if you remember, this is something that I talked about and discussed in the Why Pot of Greed is Banned video. Now, one of the things that was really cool about that video is that I got a ton of feedback from you guys asking about other cards that were banned. One of the most popular, if not the most popular, questions that I got on that video is not only why is Graceful Charity banned, but also, and this is something I'll try to answer in this video, although it's a little bit difficult, is Graceful Charity worse or better than Pot of Greed? And that is a very difficult question that I will try to tackle in today's video, but you have to understand a few things. First off, like I just said, Pot of Greed is banned right now for the same reason it was banned back in the day, that it's just a free +1 draw spell, but this is not the case with Graceful Charity, because Graceful Charity back in the day wasn't banned because it was being abused in any particular combos. The card itself is simply too strong, and I'll sort of talk about that in today's video, but more importantly, Graceful Charity can't come back to Yu-Gi-Oh! In 2019, not because the card itself is too inherently flawed, which don't get me wrong, it is, but because Graceful Charity, unlike Pot of Greed, actually has a huge upside in 2019, or really just any modern era of Yu-Gi-Oh! Starting at about 2010, that it simply didn't have back in the day. And more importantly here, we're focusing on the fact that Graceful Charity, unlike Pot of Greed, actually does technically have a drawback. But what's interesting, or at least what's interesting to me at least, is that the drawback of Graceful Charity is actually what's keeping it from coming back in 2019. In 2019, simply too many cards trigger off of being discarded or sent to the graveyard. A lot of people say that the graveyard is a second hand, and while it is a slight exaggeration, it is true enough to keep Graceful Charity banned, at least for the time being. To understand why Graceful Charity is so powerful in comparison to many of the other draw spells in Yu-Gi-Oh!, let's look at the worst case scenario. So obviously there are many good things about Graceful Charity, but the worst case scenario is if it's the only card in your hand, and that's when you activate Graceful Charity, you draw 3 cards, and then you're forced to pick 1 to keep and 2 to discard. That is the worst case scenario because you don't really get a ton of choices over what you're discarding. Keep in mind, one of the biggest benefits of Graceful Charity's setup is that if you had like 5 or 6 cards in your hand and then you use Graceful Charity, if the cards you drew weren't as useful as the other cards in your hand, you could just discard 2 of the 3 cards that you drew. It's a card that always lets you keep the best cards in your hand while getting rid of the least valuable ones, or in the case of modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, the ones that have graveyard trigger effects. But even if we just look at it as a card that lets you draw 3 and then discard 2 of the ones that you drew, if it was the only card in your hand, that is much, much better than Upstart Goblin, which I know we talk about in these videos a lot, but it is very important to compare cards like Graceful Charity and Pot of Greed to Upstart Goblin, because Upstart Goblin is a great card to look at because it was commonly played at 3 copies per deck, despite the fact that it only draws 1 card and gives your opponent life points. Perhaps an even better comparison to make to Graceful Charity, more so than Upstart Goblin, is Pot of Duality. Think of Graceful Charity as a much, much better version of Duality, and keep in mind, Duality is a very, very good card that saw tons of play for many years, but Pot of Duality restricts you from special summoning. It also puts the cards that you don't pick back into your deck, where Graceful Charity does neither of those things. It doesn't restrict you from summoning for the rest of the turn, and it also doesn't put the cards back in the deck. It puts them right in the graveyard where they might have trigger effects, or at the very least, where they're more easily accessible than they would have been in the deck. But the best case for Graceful Charity is if you open Graceful Charity, 2 good cards and 2 bad cards in your 5-card opening hand. In that case, you can use Graceful Charity to draw 3 fresh cards and discard the 2 bad cards that started out. Now, in the case of the best decks in Yu-Gi-Oh!, those quote-unquote worst cards in your hand might just be matchup dependent. If you keep in mind, like a modern deck, someone that was playing something like Twin Twisters in their main deck might not want to keep that anymore if they figure out that they're not playing against a back row heavy strategy, so you can use Graceful Charity to sort of get rid of those cards in your hand. Interestingly, Twin Twisters is an excellent example of another card that does this. When Twin Twisters is against sort of back row heavy matchups, it turns whatever the worst card in your hand is into a second copy of MST, but when you don't want to play against a back row heavy matchup, you don't have have to have 2 copies of MST in your hand. You can just have the 1 Twin Twisters, the 1 bad card. Graceful Charity takes us to a whole new level, turning whichever cards you don't want into more cards that you do want, and that is obviously very powerful. And all of these reasons are why Graceful Charity was banned in the first place. It simply allows the player to have way too much hand and deck management, especially compared to old school Yu-Gi-Oh! But what about Graceful Charity in a modern sense? Now, I mentioned at the beginning of the video that Pot of Greed is banned for the same reason now as it is 10-15 years ago, and that is absolutely true. Pot of Greed is one of the best cards in the entire game. Don't get me wrong, drawing a free 2 cards for absolutely no drawback is extremely powerful, and pretty much every deck would play it, but I also think every deck would play Graceful Charity, and unlike Pot of Greed, where you don't really notice that your opponent is getting so much more value out of the card than maybe other cards in the game, in Graceful Charity's case, especially in 2018, almost 2019, you would notice how much value your opponent is getting, because there are a lot of cards out there that get value when they're in the graveyard. Obviously, the danger cards are out, and those would be ridiculous with a card like Graceful Charity, but even if we go back a couple years and look at decks like Burning Abyss and things along those lines, pretty much every single deck after 2012 at least has some sort of graveyard effects or graveyard recursion, which makes Graceful Charity better, because at that point you're not only sort of ignoring the drawback, but you're actually getting a huge benefit from the drawback, which makes the card absolutely ridiculous, more so than Pot of Greed, at least in the combos that you would actually do with Graceful Charity. Now, obviously, if Graceful Charity was a one-of and it randomly draws cards, you're not searching the cards that you're drawing. They could be whatever is on top of your deck. It wouldn't really be a card that you would plan combos around, but it definitely would be a card that would accidentally combo as you were playing your normal games, unlike something like Pot of Greed, because Pot of Greed, you just draw those 2 cards, and then the rest of your hand sort of does whatever the combos it was going to do regardless of the Pot of Greed. However, in the case of Graceful Charity, it can actually not only be a card that draws into your combo pieces, but a card that actually starts your combos as well, something that Pot of Greed actually can't do. In other words, Graceful Charity needs to stay banned for probably all of Yu-Gi-Oh's history, not only because the card is independently powerful, just like Pot of Greed, but also because it combos with way too many modern cards, unlike Pot of Greed. On one hand, I do agree that Graceful Charity is more likely to actually win games in terms of the combos that it starts. On the other hand, Pot of Greed is a free +1. Graceful Charity technically isn't a plus unless you discard cards that you get effects off of, and I think that both of them, if we're being completely honest here, would probably be played in every single deck. But we've said that about cards before that have come off the ban list that end up not being played. A fantastic example of this is Monster Reborn, but I would argue, at least in the modern Yu-Gi-Oh sense, that Monster Reborn is a lot less powerful than Pot of Greed and Graceful Charity. Maybe back in old school Yu-Gi-Oh, Monster Reborn was illegal, and even sort of the middle school Yu-Gi-Oh, I don't know if that's what you would call it, but around the time that Monster Reborn actually got banned, which was like 2013, maybe not every single deck had sort of recursion, but if you remember 2013 when Monster Reborn actually did end up getting banned, a lot of decks didn't play it back then either. The decks that didn't play it were ones like Dragon Rulers, where every card in the deck already was just sort of recursion and special summoning. That Monster Reborn, for all intents and purposes, was ironically sort of a brick card because it wasn't a combo starter. On the other hand, cards like Pot of Greed and Graceful Charity actually do help you dig for your combos and don't ever brick your hand because they immediately replace themselves, sort of along the same lines of Upstart Goblin, except both Pot of Greed and Graceful Charity obviously have huge upsides that Upstart Goblin can never really match, just because it's a free 1-for-1 instead of a 2-for-1 or a 3-for-1 or anything along the lines of Pot of Greed and Graceful Charity. So one final way that I have to sort of determine which card is more powerful, Graceful Charity or Pot of Greed, even though I do acknowledge that both of them are almost equally as good, is this question. And what I would ask myself is, okay, if Konami was going to bring one of these cards back into Yu-Gi-Oh, which one would it be? And when I ask myself that question, and you guys can answer in the comment section below, of course, I have to say, if I'm being honest, that I think they're more likely likely to bring back Pot of Greed than they are Graceful Charity. And along that logic, I think Graceful Charity is in fact better than Pot of Greed. I still want to say though that it's not an objective analysis of these cards, and I do think both of them are extremely powerful, but I think if I really get down to it and say which card is Konami more likely to put into Yu-Gi-Oh!, it's Pot of Greed 100% of the time, just because of how much the game has changed since Pot of Greed and Graceful Charity were legal. Graceful Charity is an incredibly powerful card, as is Pot of Greed, but Graceful Charity is a card that can set up a ton of combos, which Pot of Greed simply can't do, even if it is the most consistent sheer value card out in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! As a straight +1 for free. Graceful Charity, while it isn't technically a plus, has a much greater potential to actually win games, more so than Pot of Greed. Anyway though, hopefully you guys enjoyed today's analysis video on why Graceful Charity is banned. If you'd like me to do any more videos on banned cards in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, please put your suggestions in the comment section below. I'll see you guys later though. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.